The last sequence of verses has represented a major onslaught on the tyranny of the habit energy of our moods, and more specifically on the tyrant itself, which is what I have referred to as our fundamental mood tone. Our fundamental mood tone is the mood in which we are most consistently anchored. It is essentially what limits us, and even though there might have been some insight in your life, even an enlightenment experience, this fundamental mood tone can still hover around with a certain gravitational pull, drawing awareness back into it over and over again. So the last few verses have been telling us, have been showing us even, that we are fundamentally free. We are fundamentally free to choose how we feel. And there is no limit to how good we can fundamentally feel. This is in spite of what is going on in the world, in spite of what is going on in our bodies, and in spite of this fundamental mood tone. So this is a huge thing. It's a huge thing. And it's something we can be putting into practice at every moment of the day. And a particularly telling moment is when you first wake up in the morning. What is the fundamental mood tone doing? What is your capacity for infinite bliss at that moment? So I woke up this morning feeling better than I've felt in a long time. This may be something to do with the sun shining through the window. Maybe something to do with the fact that I'm off to Cyprus for 10 days tomorrow. Maybe something to do with my medications. But I don't think so. But time will tell, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I take these teachings to heart. I have to keep coming back to them, not only because it's what my practice is, but I've embarked on this series of videos. And as I've mentioned before, sometimes the best way to learn and to appreciate something is to teach it. So I teach and practice with the help of these verses. And the next verse talks about duality in the context of enlightenment practice. We move from duality to the absolute. That's what the next verse is about. Now, this might seem a bit of a contradiction. How can there be duality and the absolute? How can the absolute become dualistic? Well, the absolute cannot be dualistic. The absolute is the absolute. Consciousness is consciousness. But consciousness comes and goes. It's like the sun, streaming out its light, radiating its heat. Although consciousness doesn't radiate anything, it's more correct to talk about emanating. But we'll just go with the analogy here and say that the sun is emanating its heat and light. So is the sun that central orb, that central glowing sphere, or is it the light that it emanates? Well, we can see that it's actually both. We're just describing it in a different way. But the sun itself, the sun of consciousness, can go with these beams of light. And when it goes with these beams of light, it can also experience darkness. So this is what happens. The further the beam of light gets from the source, the more likely it is to experience darkness or forgetfulness. But then it can remember that it's actually the sun. It isn't this little beam of light. So this is how we are as enlightenment practitioners, moving from the belief that we're this little beam of consciousness to the realization that this little beam of consciousness is actually consciousness itself, absolute consciousness, absolute awareness. It's what lights the world. So the next verses again are helping us to remember. So let's have a look. Verse 669. When dualism is upheld, there rise causation-born and no-causation-born, ignorance and suchness, etc. Not to be dualistic is suchness. So when dualism is upheld, this is when we reinforce our apparent separation. Dualism is the belief that you're a little speck of consciousness and there's lots of other specks of consciousness floating around. It's the belief in a me here and a world out there, a me here and other beings out there. Remember, in the previous video, I spoke of the practice of no living beings. Because it's the belief in other living beings that limits our potential for infinite bliss. It's not that other beings are limiting us, it's our belief in other beings and our assumptions on how they think and how we think they're perceiving us. Can you imagine how liberating it is to drop that? That's what the previous video was about. But when dualism is upheld, there rise causation-born and no-causation-born. I thought that this might be an opportunity to talk about different types of birth in Buddhism. One of these types is spontaneous birth, where you're born without any parents. And this happens when you're born into the hell realm, into one of the hell realms, or into one of the heavens. You're born spontaneously without any parents. But it's not about that. Causation-born is when you're upholding duality. It's when you're saying, it's when you're taking your cue from the world out there and saying it's got a history going right back to the beginning of time, and everything has given rise to everything else. This is causation-born, and I am a being with a history. I came from my parents and so on, and I am identifying with this being that is causation-born. But when you're practicing enlightenment, you drop all that. And you're like the little beam of consciousness, realizing it is consciousness itself, which is the light of the world. It is what is. This birth is realization, and it's really about giving up the belief in the mirage, the belief in the dream. So it's about waking up. It's about not giving birth to anything. So no-causation-born is realization itself. Ignorance and suchness. When dualism is upheld, is ignorance and suchness. So we move as enlightenment practitioners from ignorance to suchness. Suchness is pure being. Again, we awaken from the dream. We no longer invest in it, the dream of other beings. We no longer invest in it. And we come back to suchness. Not to be dualistic is suchness. And it's at this point that we can once again explore our capacity for infinite bliss. This is happiness which is independent of the world, independent of other beings, independent of our body, and independent of our fundamental mood tone. So we're not simply moving from ignorance to suchness. We are now working in suchness to dissolve the fundamental mood tone and to explore the wonderful vistas of the liberated mind.